안녕하십니까. 저는 국립현대미술관이 주최하는 토크 위기의 세계, 현대미술, 시각문화, 정치생태학의 사회를 맡은 국립현대미술관의 학예연구사 장선희입니다. 만나서 반갑습니다. 이번 토크에 참석해 주신 연사 및 참석자 여러분께 진심으로 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 토크를 진행하기에 앞서서 먼저 토크에 관해 간략한 소개를 좀 드리고자 합니다. 이번 토크에서는 요즘 현대미술 분야에서 학제간 연구의 주요 이슈로 떠오르고 있는 정치 생태학을 다룹니다. 최근 국내 여러 전시를 통해서 생태학이라는 단어는 굉장히 많이 접해 보셨을 텐데요. 가장 흔하게는 우리가 기후 변화의 담론을 둘러싼 환경 문제를 떠오르게 됩니다. 그렇다면 생태학에서 주장하는 바가 결국 환경 보호를 말하는 것인가? 라고 우리가 쉽게 생각을 할 수도 있겠는데요. 많은 전시에서 생태학을 다루고 있지만 이 학제를 우리가 어떻게 규정할 것인지 혹은 우리가 사회 경제적인 이슈와 관련해서 구체적으로 어디까지 확장해 볼 수 있을지에 관해서는 그 논의가 그렇게 많지 않다는 생각이 들었습니다. 따라서 이번 토크를 통해서 이를테면은 환경이 어떻게 착취의 대상이 되는지 혹은 노동력 그리고 자본의 착취로 이어지고 또 이러한 과정을 통해서 환경이라는 대상이 하나의 상품으로 변모하게 되는지 등에 관해서 좀 심도 깊게 논의해 보고자 합니다. 이렇게 생각한다면 우리가 생태학을 이번 토크의 제목에서도 볼 수 있듯이 정치 생태학으로 풀어갈 수 있는 근거를 찾아볼 수 있을 것이라고 생각합니다. 오늘 이 토크를 준비하면서 발표를 맡아주실 두 교수님과 이야기를 많이 했습니다. 두 분의 발제가 어떤 면에서는 그 영어 단어로는 Environmental Racism, 그러니까 환경 문제에서 비롯된 인종차별주의에 가깝다라는 이야기를 많이 했습니다. 이 개념은 현재 북미, 서유럽, 그리고 인도 지역에서는 굉장히 뜨거운 이슈가 되고 있는데요. 사실 국내에서는 인종차별주의가 심각하게 느껴지지 않을 수도 있습니다. 하지만 관점을 바꿔서 환경 문제가 결국 빈부격차의 문제로 이어지고 불평등 그리고 계급의 고착화로 연결된다고 한다면 우리가 조금 더 이 문제를 쉽게 이해할 수 있지 않을까 생각하고 있습니다. 따라서 두 교수님께서 저에게 그 인트로덕션에서 반드시 좀 이렇게 짚어주셨으면 하고 이야기를 해주신 바가 있는데요. 그 environmental racism보다는 그 한국적인 상황에서는 또 다른 영단어로 environmental classism, 즉 환경 문제에서 비롯되는 계급의 불평등 혹은 차별의 문제가 보다 더 적합한 개념이 될 것이라고 강조해 주셨습니다. 따라서 두 분의 발표 중에서는 이러한 많은 개념들에 대해서 정리를 해 주실 것이고요. 또 따라서 오늘 토크에 대한 기대가 큽니다. 또 요즘 인류세를 둘러싼 담론이 굉장히 활발합니다. 바로 인류가 지구 환경에 크게 영향을 미쳐서 지질의 시대 구분이 바뀌는 또 하나의 시점을 의미하는 그런 단어입니다. 오늘 토크 그리고 이어지는 토론에서는 우리가 인류세 담론에 어떻게 비판적으로 접근할 수 있는지 그 방법론에 대해서도 논의가 되지 않을까 싶습니다. 자, 그럼 이제 본격적으로 토크를 시작해 보도록 하겠습니다.
Thanks very much, Sunny. And thank you to Hazel and the team at the MMCA that has made this trip possible. Thank you everyone for coming. It's an honor to be speaking before you in Seoul. It's my first time in the city, although I've been to Korea before for the Gwangju Biennial in the past. So thank you again for coming, and I hope to make my presentation clear, although I'm going to be speaking largely about the social and political and environmental context in the USA. I hope this will translate into to the Korean environment. We'll see. Maybe we can discuss that in the Q&A. So let's see. So my talk is called Worlds to Come, Geoengineering, Conflictual Futurisms, and the Unthinkable. So I'd like to start by suggesting or arguing that there's no such thing as a single environmentalism. Similarly, there's no single approach to what ecology means. There's multiple worlds at stake depending on how we define the environment, how we define ecology. Okay, so for instance, I'm going to be focusing on two different approaches to the environment. And the first is what we might call neoliberal environmentalism. So this is largely referring to the world of technological and engineering-based approaches to climate change challenges and problems. And as you see in this image that's drawn from the Guardian newspaper, it shows you a variety of different approaches to geoengineering. Geoengineering is basically, different ways technologically to influence the Earth's environment. So we can control weather and temperatures based on distributing aerosol sprays in the atmosphere. We can put mirrors in the sky to deflect sunlight, to control solar radiation, to control ultimately the heat and the global warming effects of climate change. In this way, there's a lot of organizations and political and economic forces, as well as scientific research bodies and universities that are attempting to argue that we can, through these procedures, through these technologies, produce what is referred to as a good Anthropocene. This, according to the Breakthrough Institute, which is a policy think tank based in San Francisco, California, means a coming world where humans will use their growing social, economic, and technological powers to make life better for people, stabilize the climate, and protect the natural world. So that is the definition by the Breakthrough Institute of the good Anthropocene. They speak about this in a lot of different areas, including their Eco-Modernist Manifesto, which they wrote collectively a few years ago, and it's based on the idea that we can respond to climate change threats and the impending catastrophe of global warming, of desertification, of species extinction, of habitat fragmentation, of water and air and soil pollution, through mobilizing technologies to recreate the conditions of life on Earth, to actually produce something that's better than what came before. So this is their idea of eco-modernism. In other words, we shouldn't think about going back to a pre-modern past to address the challenges of climate transformation. Instead, we should try to modernize further, but in a smart way that includes green technologies. So this is the platform based on the idea of eco-modernism. Now, completely different from that approach to ecology and climate change is forms of environmentalism that insist on thinking about environment in relationship to social inequalities and political oppressions. And specifically, I want to think about this in relationship to a video by the US-based artist Arthur Jafa, who's an African-American artist who did a video a few years ago in 2016 called "Love is the Message is Death." And these are a variety of still images from that video that, as you see, focuses rather directly on scenes of police brutality that frequently involve white male police officers arresting, but also brutalizing and being very violent with African American people who often have little access to political, social, and economic power historically as a result of centuries of forms of racism, specifically biological racism, that was largely behind the transatlantic slavery episode of the United States. So I'd like to play his video, and then I'm going to talk more about how his video relates to environmental racism and also political ecology. Okay, so the video is about 8 minutes long, and this is a viewing copy, so the quality isn't as good as it should be, but it will give you a sense of what the video is about, and it might not be obvious at first why this is related to the environment or how it could be related to ecology, but I'm going to argue afterwards and try to explain why I think it's really crucial, actually, to think about ecology in a political way in relationship to that neoliberal version of environmentalism that I began with. Okay, so this is the 8-minute video, and just a warning. It's again, there's some difficult and even violent scenes in it, so please prepare yourself for that. Okay, so this is Love is the message is death. It's 8 minutes long. I always find when I do this talk and I show the video, it's really hard to make a transition back into the presentation, just because it's really such a ferocious and devastating video. It's very emotional, actually. I want to position ecology in relationship to that video, and let me do so, first of all, by citing the work of Stefano Harney and Fred Moten from an essay that they wrote about the killing of the African-American Michael Brown in Ferguson a few years ago. And they write, the 2015 killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, represents the ongoing event of resistance to and resistance before socio-ecological disaster, where modernity's constitution in the transatlantic slave trade, settler colonialism, and capital's emergence in and with the state is the socio-ecological disaster. So, in other words, where some might think of ecology as pertaining to the science that describes relations between an organism and its environment in the natural, more than human world, this is a completely different and politicized relation to ecology that stresses its socio-ecological and political ecological dimensions. And I think that that's clear in Jafa's video. So in that sense, it connects to a long history of what we might refer to as environmental racism. Environmental racism is inequality based on race expressed ecologically. So as Robert Bullard defines it, who's regarded as the father of environmental justice in the US, who's done a lot of work in relationship to environmental racism, he says some people are more equal than others in the US. If you're poor, working class, or a community of color, you get less protection. You get less enforcement of pollution laws. You live closer to hazardous waste, toxic trash, pollution, polluted air, soil, and water. So correspondingly, environmental justice embraces the principle that all people and communities have the right to equal protection and equal enforcement of environmental laws and regulations. So this history that came about over the years and dates back to the 1960s in particular has been really important for my thinking in relationship to political ecology and contemporary art. So I'm really interested and drawn, and I think it's crucial that we pay attention to artists who are making work that is investigating this relation, this socio-ecological condition of contemporary existence. I define it, and this is a recent essay that I published that you can find online in the journal Panorama. I define ecology as a mode of intersectionality, which insists on the inseparability between environmental matters of concern and socio-political and economic frameworks of justice and injustice. So ecology is not just about relationality within the non-human world. it's also a form of relationality between racism or classism, forms of ethnic or religious intolerance. So all these ways of describing power relations of inequality, I think, connect to ecology as intersectionality. I've dealt, as Sunny mentioned, I've dealt with this in several projects of mine, including this book, Against the Anthropocene, Visual Culture and Environment Today, which is a book that attempts to argue that Anthropocene discourse tends to produce a very universalizing and generalizing understanding of ecology as something that doesn't have any political traction, isn't related to economic inequality, and simply is a matter of climate transformation that affects everyone equally. While we know that that's far from the case, right? Climate change is going to impact the most vulnerable and the least resourced more than anyone else. So it's important to think, I think very critically about the Anthropocene within science studies, within the humanities, and culture at large, because it's becoming increasingly dominated, in fact, by neoliberal economic interests. And I want to explain why that is the case. If you're interested in this kind of work, I also have created the Center for Creative Ecologies at my university in California, and we have a newsletter. You can follow our activities if you check out the website and sign up to get basically quarterly reports on our activities. So this is a platform to bring together the arts and humanities together with environmental studies and climate science, to think these interdisciplinary relations all together. A lot of other people have written about the Anthropocene and trying to mobilize this field of environmental humanities in critical ways. And I'm largely in agreement with a range of different other people who are writing about this, including Donna Haraway, who's a colleague of mine at UC Santa Cruz, or Jason Moore, or Anat Singh, or John Bellamy Foster. Different approaches to thinking about ecology, for instance, from a Marxist background, or from a multi-species ethnographic approach, or from political ecology methodology. However, when we begin to look at Anthropocene discourse, it becomes really clear that the Anthropocene is really fundamentally connected to neoliberal economics. And this is clear when you look at, for instance, the earliest definitions of the Anthropocene in the work of the scientists Paul Crutzen and Eugene Stormer. This is just a couple references from their work around 2000 that first defined the term according to its current usage. So these are the people who defined the Anthropocene. And in these texts, they make a clear relation between the Anthropocene, climate change, and the necessity of geoengineering as the favored approach to solving climate challenges. How do we date the Anthropocene? The Anthropocene is not yet defined in terms of its so-called boundary events. So when does it begin? Does it begin with the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century? Does it begin with the nuclear age in the 1940s? Or can we trace it back, as some people do, to the so-called Orbis spike? And I think this is the approach that I'm most interested in, where the Orbis spike is about that time around between 1492 and 1600, basically corresponding with the colonization of the Americas by European powers, when some 50 million indigenous people in the Americas perished, died as a result of warfare, of invasion, of colonization, of disease, of forced labor, of forms of slavery, and all the land that those people lived on, roughly 50 million people, the land started to reforest itself. And there was a massive uptake of carbon owing to the reforestation of land in the Americas. So basically, colonization can be measured within the climate record. So there was a massive cooling effect owing to the Orbis spike. And I think this is really useful and important in terms of defining when the Anthropocene begins, because it insists on linking the Anthropocene to colonial violence, basically, and forms of genocide. So we have ecocide and genocide converging within the very origins of modernity in relationship to the Anthropocene. So if the Anthropocene as a discourse tends to universalize and speak about human species without differentiating, right? The Anthropocene describes climate change that will affect everyone, supposedly, without any differences. Unlike that approach to a kind of universalist neo-humanism, the political ecology that we find in Arthur Jafa's video is profoundly focused on racial and class-based relations of inequality. And I want to argue that this is really crucial if we're to have any conception of environmental justice in terms of the climate change threat. So we see over a number of different images from the video scenes of police brutality, of state violence, of cops shooting black people with impunity. This has been massively visible within the states. And as people argue, it's not anything that's new necessarily. These forms of racialized state violence isn't necessarily new. What's new is the prevalence of cell phone technologies that enable people to capture these scenes. So that's what Arthur Jafa is drawing on to produce this archive of appropriated imagery that he's found online from different sources that he compiles together into that video, Love is the Message is Death. So when the African-American writer and researcher Christina Sharp, in her book called In the Wake on Blackness and Being, when she describes this notion of anti-blackness as total climate, I think that relates directly to Arthur Jafa's video and understandings of ecology as political ecology, right? We can't simply limit our understanding of ecology and environmentalism to a generalized abstract notion of temperature change, of 2 degrees Celsius warming in the next 100 years, or sea level rise, or anything like that, right? We have to talk about the differential impacts that are not that are intrinsic to racial and class, ethnic relations between people. So anti-blackness as total climate refuses to limit our understanding of ecology to a very narrow biogeophysical relation. So for my work, this is really an important redefinition of our understandings of ecology. So isn't that what we see in these images from the video? Yes, these are scenes of police brutality, as in this well-known clip that was taken of a police officer who is arresting a young woman who's wearing a bikini, who was just at a pool party in Texas in the southern U.S. This was a very controversial, very visible media event. But it also depicts a scene of political ecology. It depicts a scene of the state management of environmental conditions. It's about the control of atmospheres, of inequality, where some people can live in certain ways and other people are prohibited from doing things, right? It's about the control of bodies in space. That, I think, is what Fred Moten and Stefano Harney are referring to as ecology, as a socio-ecological instance of relationality. Okay? In Jafa's video, we see lots of different scenes that also date this back historically. So we're seeing here scenes of police brutality in relationship to the civil rights movement for the movement for equality, for racial equality in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s, a really important development historically in our country. And you notice police using water, for instance, from fire hoses, and all sorts of different ways of weaponizing water, as Terri Weissman is going to talk about in her own presentation, I think. You see that as further instances of climate as a mode of anti-blackness in his video. Similarly, this goes all the way back to early 20th century history and the formation of groups like the Ku Klux Klan, white supremacy. Again, further instances of an ecological relation when we're thinking from a methodology of political ecology. Okay, so unlike that entrance into environmental justice, right? The Eco-Modernist Manifesto of the Breakthrough Institute that I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk, if you read the manifesto doesn't mention the words race, equality, or justice at all, right? It's purely an abstract and technical, scientific approach to environmentalism. It's what some would call, again in the US context, an articulation of a white environmentalism, basically an ecology of affluence or an ecology of privilege, right, that tends to universalize concerns in order to refuse to discuss the problems of the tremendous forms of inequality that exist today, that have existed historically, and that seem to be growing, right? We know that roughly 7 or 8 people worldwide own as much wealth as the bottom half of the human population together, right? That's 7 or 8 people own as much wealth as roughly 3.6 billion people. On the other hand, the Eco-Modernist Manifesto mentions human and technology and growth repeatedly, right? So you can see where their concerns lie, and it's very easy to mount a critical reading of this project on the basis of political ecology. Ecology does appear in Arthur Jafa's video. If you noticed this clip, right? These are 2 African-American people walking through floodwaters. This is right after Hurricane Katrina, the superstorm that hit New Orleans in Louisiana in 2005, right? So you see, this is a classic instance of environmental injustice, right? The people who are least resourced, who have no access to mobility or to protection, are the ones who suffer the worst impacts of ongoing climate transformation, right? Similarly, the scenes of a police officer arresting a mother and her 2 children, right? Absolutely intolerable, painful, tragic episodes of inequality, where we see again that instance of anti-blackness as total climate, right? So climate change is not about simply carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's also about power relations that are racialized, sexualized, related to class, ethnicity, on the ground, right? It's important to, I think, at least to connect the two, rather than avoid socioeconomic inequality altogether, as the Breakthrough Institute does. So it's not surprising in the sense that the current political formation in the States, which is has been spreading worldwide in relationship to forms of right-wing populism, and even what some are referring to as an emergent fascism, are also expressions of Anthropocene discourse. And so I was really interested in this and had an intuition and started researching it, and I found all these articles online that related Donald Trump and his administration and their policy, basically, as the very face of the neoliberal Anthropocene. This is really interesting and alarming, actually. So there were many suns and solar flares in Arthur Jafa's video. Again, it's as if he's recognizing in the video the very fact that as growing socioeconomic inequalities become, deathly and catastrophic on the ground, it's not unrelated to environmental transformation, which, according to climate and environmental justice understandings, climate transformation exacerbates or it worsens forms of inequality. So again, there's a continual relationality within Jafa's video between what's happening in terms of biogeophysical transformations and sociopolitical modes of inequality. Also in the video, he shows scenes of monsters. Like there's a clip of Alien. There's a clip from Cloverfield. These are American horror films, right, where these monsters appear threatening to destroy Earth. And I think that there's an interesting element within his video where he's translating these scenes of quotidian, everyday police brutality to a cosmopolitical scope through this allegory of science fiction or horror films that show the catastrophic destruction of planet Earth. There's a real fear, in other words, of an ongoing end of the world. But I want to ask, along with other critics that are thinking about this same issue, I want to ask, in relationship to climate change, what is behind this fear of a near future end of the world? And as many other people, including indigenous peoples, African American peoples, generally coming from traditions of the oppressed, asked, haven't our worlds already ended, sometimes hundreds of years ago? Whose urgency, in other words, is at stake right now? And how can we think these urgencies behind catastrophism in relationship to each other to avoid furthering the conditions of environmental injustice today? The Breakthrough Institute also talks about monsters. This is from their website, where they're republishing an essay by the French sociologist Bruno Latour, who gets a lot of play and is an influencer in relationship to science studies and Anthropocene discourse and climate change science. And in this essay, he writes, we must care for our technologies as we do our children. Basically, what he's arguing in this essay is that, again, the solution to climate change shouldn't be turning away from technology. Rather, we should embrace it and become responsible for it. That seems, like a good idea. However, what it ultimately supports, especially through the Breakthrough Institute's website, is a pro-geoengineering position, which argues that technological developments are the best way to address climate transformation. In other words, we shouldn't try to change ourselves or our ways of life or our consumerist habits or our growth economies or our overproduction or our carbon-intensive lifestyles. We should instead geoengineer our way out of the crisis. For Naomi Klein, who's a really important climate activist, this is nonsense, and she takes issue and criticizes Bruno Latour really heavily by basically arguing for system change, not climate change. We need to change our systems of human organization, from transportation to energy to all elements of life, rather than simply try to invent techno-fixes so that we can continue the forms of economic inequality that exist today. And you begin to see through, if you do research and read these responses to to geoengineering, that basically geoengineering is it functions as a kind of ideological mechanism to support the idea that we can just continue the status quo and not change anything about our socioeconomic and political organization. It's basically a recipe for the continuation of profound levels of economic inequality worldwide. You see that if you do research, again, into the emerging space economy, which, as in this diagram shows, is understood by some as a modern-day gold rush, right? So it says asteroid mining, for instance, will create $1 trillion industry. So what is behind this are really private corporate interests that are arguing that if we continue to develop our technologies and potentially think about moving into the off-world space of interplanetary existence, we can begin to actually not only save ourselves but colonize the atmosphere. This is about basically privatizing outer space, privatizing the galaxy. It's really, I don't know, it's hard to underestimate what is happening right now in relationship to these developments. And although it seems like science fiction, it's actually happening, and there's millions and billions of dollars that are going into this already today. So this is one example. I know it's hard to read, but it's called the Scopex experiment. It's an actual experiment, a scientific experiment in the field, in the actual atmosphere, in an area above Tucson, Arizona, where scientists, including an engineer, David Keith from Harvard University, it's the first ever actual real live geoengineering test experiment that has occurred, and it's going on right now, and it's funded to the tune of roughly $20 million. So massive amounts of resources are going into geoengineering experiments. And who's funding it? Just quickly, it's largely coming from the tech industry. So people like Bill Gates of Microsoft, Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, Google, all the major tech corporations of IT, Silicon Valley Capital, are supporting these initiatives. Elon Musk of Tesla are supporting these initiatives. And it's basically, I want to argue, is a form of colonizing our future. Because that's what geoengineering does ultimately, insofar as it makes it imperative to try to solve the climate crisis through technological means. It basically allows climate change to continue into the future. And so at a certain point, we've lost the ability to respond and mitigate the effects of climate disaster. So it's interesting that David Keith, who's a professor at Harvard University in climate engineering, is also the CEO of his own company. So he hopes he's like a venture capitalist in the sense that he's trying to create an industry that he'll benefit from also economically. So there's massive conflicts of interest at stake here as well. So one of the ways that geoengineering hopes to solve the climate crisis is to whiten the environment. And I want to think about what that means to whiten the environment through aerosols in the troposphere. I want to think about that in relationship to what the South African-based philosopher Achille Mbembe calls the becoming black of the world. So in other words, at a time when there's growing economic inequality, growing poverty, growing precarity, which is what Mbembe calls becoming black, right? At the very time that this is happening, there's also an initiative to whiten the environment, to whiten the skies. One go-to text that people like Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg really like is this book, Homo Deus, by Yuval Noah Harari. who's an Israeli historian. Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow. And in this book, which is really like a popular approach to thinking about a high-tech futurism, is basically to propose that with the Anthropocene, with the good Anthropocene, and these technological mobilizations, we're reaching a point where human beings can create the new conditions on Earth. So it's akin to becoming like a god. So Homo Deus is the Latin for the divine, divine humanity, basically, right? So this is the kind of utopian, neoliberal tech fantasy that people like Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and others, and I suspect there's equivalents all over the world, including in Korea, of this idea of a utopian future which can be controlled technologically through genetic engineering, through geoengineering, through all sorts of interventions within the natural world to create a new Eden on Earth, as some have called it. So this is interesting also because even the most hardcore climate-denying Texas Republican can support geoengineering because it's pro-tech and they can view it as an economic opportunity. So this is really fascinating within the US to see how climate denialism can support geoengineering as a solution to the climate change that they won't even acknowledge. Just one other quick element here is that scientists like David Keith are also developing ways of responding to what they call counter geoengineering. So that's what if a so-called rogue state like Iran, according to the US perspective, develops its own geoengineering that negatively impacts US climates? How can the US respond militarily through counter geoengineering? So this is, in other words, geoengineering is becoming neoliberalized, and it's also becoming militarized within a near future of catastrophic weather wars. This is the world that we have to look forward to. So I'm gonna wind down and conclude now. In Arthur Jafa's piece, he also includes not just deathly, brutal, violent images of police violence and state violence. He also includes a lot of very positive representations of African American political, cultural, sports-based forms of creativity and amazing resilience, from Jimi Hendrix to Angela Davis, right? And this is really important. It's what Jafa refers to as the abject sublime. I hope the translators can translate this. It's a complex phrase, right? The abject sublime. It's a phrase that brings together the most catastrophic, disastrous elements with beautiful, amazing hopefulness, right? How can we contain both of those in a single aesthetic expression? The abject sublime really is what he's going for in his video. He also quotes this essay by Martine Sims called The Mundane Afro-Futurist Manifesto. You can find this online if you're interested. There's a whole resurgence of Afrofuturism online through musical culture, through artistic culture that goes back a few decades now. And it's really vibrant, and this is an amazing expression that, again, appears in Arthur Jafa's video. It refers to musicians like Sun Ra, George Clinton, Parliament, to contemporaries like Janelle Monáe. There's a whole, multiple ranges of approaches to Afrofuturism. But for Martine Sims, she wants to say that Afrofuturism can't just be about imagining a utopian black future. It has to be mundane, it has to be worldly. And what she means by this is represented in this quote where she writes, "Mundane Afrofuturism is the ultimate laboratory for world building outside of imperialist, capitalist, white patriarchy." I think that captures perfectly what an environmental justice approach to political ecology would be. For Arthur Jafa's video, love is the message is death. So Jafa also includes images of black activists, civil rights leaders, and politicians from Martin Luther King Jr. to Malcolm X to Barack Obama. But I love this quote of Martin Luther King Jr. that reads, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And this is an idea that I think is really important to the question, why should anyone who's not part of African American culture be concerned with this? And the reason is, I think Martin Luther King suggests, we have to be concerned because we're all in one way or another implicated, especially, and this is myself speaking from my position as someone who lives in the States. This is really a disastrous situation that's unfolding, and it's imperative. It becomes crucial for us all to intervene and to try to locate ourselves within these inequalities, to try to support the formation of a world that we want to live in. And this is ultimately the ambition of political ecology within the cultural sphere. Just to return to Fred Moten, Fred Moten is a really important current African-American poet and performance studies scholar. Okay? He wrote a very important book with Stefano Harney that's got a lot of resonance within the States and in Europe called The Undercommons. And Fred Moten writes, thinking of Black studies, the academic discipline, he says, the project of Black studies, on the most fundamental level, it is to try to save the earth, and on a secondary level, to save the possibility of human existence, right? That's the project, that's the ethical, political project of Black studies. And I'm very much in agreement with that, and I want to borrow that and advance it and amplify it within my own position within the arts, right? So I want to argue that if the project of contemporary art and activism is also to save the world, which is emerging as a world historical, ethical, political imperative, then our understanding of ecology must be based upon human rights and climate justice. In other words, not the neoliberal Anthropocene that avoids inequality and injustice. If not, we risk what some are calling climate apartheid, with solutions only benefiting the wealthy and well-resourced, and climate change, climate transformation, climate breakdown having disaster effects on the rest of us. So this is the ultimate point of my work here today and in general, nothing less than to try to save the world in the way that I've described it here today. Thank you very much.